It's time to ignite your soul and unlock your full potential. Join us on Beneath the Helmet, the podcast exploring firefighters' health and wellness. Hosted by retired fire chief Arjuna George, our podcast is the perfect place to start your journey towards becoming the best version of yourself. So come on, let's join the conversation and find out what sets your soul on fire.
All right, welcome to Beneath the Helmet. I'm your host, Arjuna George. Episode number 1. We have a real treat today with a firefighter from Burlington, 21 years of service, James Rychard from Burlington, Ontario. James is a multi-talented, multi-passionate kind of person with a degree in psychology, 21 years of service in both career and paid-on-call environments. He's a regular contributor for Canadian Firefighter magazine. And today we're going to talk about burnout, self-care, and leadership. So make sure you watch the whole episode. It's bound to provide you some great tips and some nuggets to take away for your own fire service. Be sure to check out the show notes. All the resources and books that are noted in this episode will be noted in there as well. Make sure you subscribe to this new channel, Beneath the Helmet, which is a show to support firefighters across the world, mind, body, and spirit, everything beneath the helmet. Until next time, stay well. Enjoy the episode. So, James, I just want to kind of start off, get people to know you. Tell us a bit about yourself, your life journey up to now, and what brought you to where you are today.
First of all, thank you very much for having me. It's really an honor. I've been following your work on LinkedIn for such a long time, and you and I have connected before. Our lines of thinking are completely on par with each other, so it's a real honor to be here. Let's see, where do I start? I went to university. I got a psychology degree. I originally wanted to be a teacher, a kindergarten teacher, but that kind of didn't pan out for me. So I took a skills and interest test to find out what else I could do. Firefighting came up as one of them. After that, it was about 3.5 years, and I finally got in. And once I got into the fire service, I was really loving it. But I think really the turning point for me is my first department that I worked for, Cambridge. The fire chief, Terry Allen, there created an officer development program in a library. So I ended up stumbling upon Canadian organizational behavior textbook. And inside of it, as I was leafing through it, I uncovered workplace stress. And I was really enamored with the topic and started focusing more and more about how this was very applicable to the education that I had, my post-secondary education. And I was like, whoa, this is really interesting. So I got permission, ended up going down to Richmond Hill that was holding the health and safety by a naturopathic doctor. And I was just sold. I ended up bringing that back to Cambridge, told my fire chief all about it because I was on the health and wellness committee. We created the first Ontario Wellness Symposium 6 months later. And I've been hooked on it ever since. So I'm all about mental health and wellness and leadership and relationship building. And yeah, it's been an interesting journey, that's for sure. And that was that would have been in 2006. Yeah, 17 years ago.
Yeah, excellent. How about your childhood? Did you grow up where you live now, or what?
Oh, I'm actually born and raised in Quebec, the eastern townships of Quebec. So my family was always 500 miles away.
Yes.
But I came to Ontario, I think it was when I was 10 years old. And I ironically, ended up going back to Quebec to do my university, my studies to be closer to my family. And then decided to pop back here into Ontario.
Just going off your psychology degree, how do you see that playing into your role now as a firefighter?
Everything. I think there's really some undervalue with the vocation of psychology. It's all about human behavior. It's all about understanding emotions, about understanding how organizational dynamics works. It's just by understanding how the person and the human works, it gives you a real advantage when you're trying to deal with people, deal with conflict, resolution, teamwork. With psychology, you have a tendency during non-emergency to sit back, observe, and just be very calculated in just how you approach situations. And it's interesting just watching the dynamics unfold itself.
The fire service is such a human-based business. What a perfect education, background, knowledge, skill set to have, right? Because we are a human business. That's what, and I know you and I have talked about humanizing the fire service and humanizing mental health.
Absolutely. I think for the longest time, I think in the beginning, when I was trying to become a firefighter, psychology wasn't really too advantageous. But I think now it's becoming more prominent. You're seeing more and more people that are coming in with university degrees in the social sciences, sociology, psychology, anthropology, and they all are applicable. So it's really great to see.
So, James, as you know, I got a big background in burnout. I experienced personal burnout myself, and that's what's launched this whole podcast. And my mission moving forward is educating the world about organizational burnout, especially in emergency services. And I know you're very passionate about burnout as well. So, give us your thoughts and views on what you think burnout is and how it's affecting the fire service in particular.
It's interesting actually, because I wrote an article for firefighting in Canada, probably my third article that I wrote, and was actually made to be the feature. So it actually made the cover. I was really honored by that. And what I ended up finding was that there's a stress management doctor that works out of Oakville. His name's Dr. David Posen. And he was a former physician turned stress management expert. And he has a fantastic book called Is Work Killing You? A Doctor's Prescription to Treating Workplace Stress.
Yeah.
And inside of it, he talks about the stress cycle, the stress response, and he also talks about burnout. And I find that his point of view about burnout is just spot on. It's not just about the workplace stress itself in terms of the volume, velocity, and abuse that goes on within the organization, but it's also from the lack of rewards. So if I can, and then probably be paraphrasing Dr. Posen here, but he was saying, and I captured this in my article, was that if a firefighter, for example, is interested in doing some sort of initiative and they're not being recognized for that, that firefighter will try again. And then if they're not recognized, they will try again as well. What happens is it takes them down this road of just, I'm going to try harder. I'm going to put more work, more effort in. And then it becomes this, my efforts or my rewards are not there for the efforts that I'm putting in. And then I think this is what creates this cynicism. This is what creates that reduced personal efficacy that comes from the idea of being burnt out. So it's not just about the volume, the velocity, and the abuse of the workload from chronic work stress, but it's also from that lack of rewards. In other words, people need to be recognized for the efforts that they're putting in if we want the efforts to continue.
And I think higher you go up in the ranks as well, probably less recognition you actually get. So if it's already starting at the firefighter rank, imagine what it's like in the officers, chief level officer, and the fire chief. It's probably less and less recognition as you go up the ladder. And I felt that definitely.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And on that note, there's so many firefighters that want to make such a significant contribution to their profession. But it seems traditionally, I'm just speaking very generally speaking, is that if you're not an officer, you might not be regarded as maybe you have some sort of contribution. And I think that needs to be really reevaluated, because there's so many smart firefighters that come to the table, so many different frames of references, so many cognitive diversities that can actually help in problem solve. I'm hoping that the article that I wrote on burnout and understanding the 2 points of why I believe that it occurs in support with Dr. David Posen's point of view would actually get out there and help some firefighters as well as fire service leaders for that matter.
Yeah, I read that article and actually saved it on my Evernote. But just for the listeners, what was the title of that article?
Beware of burnout.
Great.
Yeah. And then it has a picture of a Randy Glasbergen cartoon of two colleagues. One person's actually wearing a smoke detector on the top of their head, and the other colleague goes and says, "Why are you wearing a smoke detector?" And then the guys, or I can't remember if it was the guy or the girl, but they say, "The boss thinks I'm headed for a burnout."
So true. So true.
Yeah. So the smoke alarm will go off if they're starting to heat up.
Talking about burnout more in depth, what can we as a fire service do better in regards to burnout? What do you think we can do better as a fire service?
Well, I think in terms of burnout, I think the biggest thing is to have more awareness. We need to understand what constitutes burnout, which is that emotional exhaustion, the cynicism, and the lack of reduced personal efficacy, personal accomplishment. First thing first is we need to be aware of all that. Second thing is we need to understand that we can't do it all. There's goals. There's lots of goals and initiatives we all have, but putting too much on our plate, we just can't do it. We're not robots. We're not a sponge in terms of we can absorb everything. We get to the point where being super saturated, so we can't do everything itself. And I think the other thing is you just got to nurture yourself. You got to be in a good state of well-being. really care for yourself, both personally as well as professionally, and just knowing when to say no.
When you consider burnout, is there fingers to point, or is it who's responsible for being burnt out, do you think? What's your thought?
Actually, it's the joint responsibility of the worker as well as the organization. To sit there and say it's all the organization is not true, but to say it's all the worker, it's not true as well. So there needs to be a joint effort of, getting that awareness out, understanding the differences with what we need to do to just make it a safer place. I think psychological safety plays a huge piece
For
in
sure.
people burning out. You talk about the Yerkes Dodson law that was created back in 1908, and they actually identified that there was 3 points on this bell curve. One was boredom, the top was peak performance, and then the bottom was burnout. And the
Mhm.
things that we want to keep ourselves at the top of that bell curve, so we're in that optimal performance state. So we're away from boredom, but we're certainly away from burnout. And the idea is that by maintaining that ideal performance state, we're going to actually get the best out of our workers. Problem is though sometimes is that people can become very bored, which is just the opposite end of being burnt out. So you got to find that little happy medium spot.
Any thoughts or tips on people who are listening right now on strategies you could do for your own self-care, for your own well-being to stay in that optimal level versus being bored or burnt out?
Yeah, absolutely. If I could also just suggest reading the Harvard Business Review's The Making of a Corporate Athlete, Dr. Jim Lear and Tony Schwartz wrote a fantastic paper that focuses on that ideal performance state. And they basically say you need to take care of your physical, your emotional, your mental, and your spiritual capacities. And by putting good habits in place, good rituals in place, we can actually keep that peak performance pyramid going. And that increases the propensity for someone to maintain that ideal performance state. Now, you're talking about performance psychologists basically wrote this paper. So if he's working with professional athletes, like Olympic athletes and stuff like that, and if he's created this peak performance pyramid as a way to just use to measure to keep people in that ideal performance state, then I think it's something we can definitely heed.
You talk about one of your favorite models, which is the Holmes and Rahe scale. Probably not a lot of people are familiar with that. You want to go over what that looks like and how that.
Yeah. So it was in 1967, Dr. Holmes and Thomas Ray created this scale that they used to try to identify life change units that a person could go through. They used marriage as the barometer, as the median piece. And then they gave median values to things such as divorce, such as a change of a job. And they totaled, there was about 43 life change units that a person could actually endure. Now, don't get me wrong, this was 1967, so this doesn't include the technology that we have of today.
Yeah.
So I believe it's being updated. But the Holmes and Rahe stress scale is still being used by doctors and physicians today. The idea with it is that it gives someone, a firefighter and a fire service leader, the qualitative and the quantitative means to measure and monitor life stress. For example, firefighters have a very high divorce rate, like a lot more than the general public. And what was interesting is, according to the general public, the incidence of a second and a third divorce increases by about 12%. So it's 62% and 74%, respectively. Coincidentally, divorce is 73 points on that scale. Now, that puts someone, a firefighter or fire service leader, at 24.33% chance that they could develop a stress related illness. And the doctors basically identified and they said, once you reach the 300% threshold, the individuals or the subjects that they were examining had an 80% chance of developing a stress related illness in the next 24 months.
Wow.
So the interesting thing about this tool, which is something that you can find within Yellow Ribbon Report update with the International Association of Fire Chiefs Volunteer and Combination Officers section, is that it gives firefighters and fire service leaders the way to monitor and manage how much more they can take on. And I think that's a brilliant way of basically saying there's a little bit more autonomy that we can do without activating that EAP program or any extra support services to just know how much more we can put on our plates. It's a really cool tool and I've used it a few times.
I guess that's the thing. You could probably do this multiple times through your career, through your life, and see what changes throughout that. I know when I was going through burnout, I made a life events before I even knew what this scale was, and I used the scale later on. But I made a list of all my major life events that caused me stress, trauma, worry, concern, whatever that was. And it was a darn big list. And then when I put into the scale, I was blown away at how much I had on my plate. So yeah, is that a free test or is that something you have to pay for?
No, it's free. The
Nice.
American Psychological Association has put it out there for a free PDF,
Great.
and people can download that anytime they want. What's really incredibly interesting about this test, and I know this goes back, or this tool, it goes back to 1967, is that it really puts the firefighter and the fire service leader in the driver's seat. It gives them more control. So they can monitor how much more life events they can actually take on.
And I think you might have touched on this, but it doesn't even address the stress and trauma that fire service brings onto us, right? This is strictly for the general public. So when you add the stressors of being a firefighter, that's probably even more. Is that right?
100%. And it's interesting. That's like a little segue to my other article I wrote called The Sandwich Effect, which, I came up with this idea or this theory, and I'm sure people could attest to what I'm talking about, is that if you work in an organization that's not really supportive, could be regarded as dysfunctional, it's very possible that firefighters who are having difficult times at home, and then I guess we could use the Holmes and Rahe stress scale and going through a divorce, which causes a great amount of impact. If you don't have that place to resolve, it kind of sandwiches that firefighter between going home and working to the vulnerability and the unpredictability of the operational stress. So the sandwich effect is basically just a theory to say that if there's too much personal stress going on at home and organizationally there's too much stress at work, it sandwiches that firefighter in the operational stress. So normally what someone could do where the water, if you want to use the metaphor of the water falling off the duck's back kind of thing, maybe this time it sticks a little bit more. And I think this is an interesting point, only to the thing that firefighters are not machines. We're human beings. Fire service leaders are not machines. We're human beings. We need rest. We need a place of resolve. We need to charge those batteries again. Fire fighting in general is very unpredictable. We'll train, we'll do whatever we can to try to be as best prepared as possible, but we don't know what we're going to get. This is why I think it's interesting, because the unpredictability of the job itself is something that we can't control, but it's these organizational factors and the personal factors that go on in our life that we can. And I think as we take more responsibility, take more control with the things that we can, firefighters will live longer and will have healthier careers.
100%. Yeah. What's in your control? Deal with that. Don't mess around with the stuff that's out of your control. And your
Yeah.
own mental well-being, your own nutrition, health, fitness, that's all in your control. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Couldn't agree more. Yeah. It's interesting you talk about the three elements of mind, body, and spirit. Essentially, the theme of this podcast is beneath the helmet, everything beneath the helmet of mind, body, and spirit. And I think that is the key to firefighter well-being moving forward, personally.
And that's a really good point, Arjuna, because when people look at firefighters and they think, you are the industrial athletes, you are the people, you are those individuals within our communities that we expect to show up, la creme de la creme, right? Fire chief once told me, he says, when the public calls 911, they don't get to go through the yellow book or the yellow pages. And back then, I guess we had our telephone books. So we don't get to go through the
Yep.
yellow pages and say, oh, we're going to take this. No, this person, we're going to take that person. You get what you get. So I think this is where there's a great sense of responsibility for both the individual and the organization to say, we do need to take care of our physical, our mental, our emotional, and our spiritual capacities. And on a note of that, spiritual does not have to necessarily represent religion or religious. It can be spiritual, and just in terms of like your soul, why you're doing something, your purpose, your passion. And I find that those that can connect spiritually, know who they are, know what they stand for, also have greater ways of just managing stress, having that sense of emotional resiliency, if you will.
Yeah, that ability to have some introspection of what you're going through, your body, what people go through life, including myself a long time ago, was without ever feeling what's going on inside your body, just being numb to it, avoiding it, ignoring it. And I think those are all key aspects of spirituality when you become who your true self is. Like you said, it has nothing to do with religion. It's about who you are as a person, your most authentic self. That's when you're really going to shine and thrive in your career, when you can be your true self.
The spiritual capacity was interesting for me because when I got on with Burlington, which was 4.5 years after Cambridge, my father was in the final stages, stage 4 cancer. And it was pretty stressful. Starting a new job, I moved, I relocated as well, and dealing with my dad. And then when I lost him, I had a really hard time. I no doubt. So I needed to seek out assistance where I sought out Dr. David Posen. And I also sought out, ironically enough, the naturopathic doctor that I used when we built the first wellness symposium so many years
Mhm.
ago, or that year. And I said, "Hey, what would you recommend?" And he told me, "You need to read this book called The Monk Who Sold His Ferrari." To me, there was like this prescription to better health. There was this working with this naturopathic doctor, working with the stress management doctor, applying some of the principles that they're talking about. And then through this book, This Monk Who Sold His Ferrari, I started to really accept, I started really to grip this spirituality piece. And I started communing with nature a little bit more. I started getting out to the conservation area. Burlington, Halton region has a fantastic set of conservation areas. And I started really walking and allowing those senses to really come out, the smells, not the taste, of course, but the smells, the sounds, the sight. It
Mhm.
really had this therapeutic way of just dealing with problems and what you were dealing with. And I was able to get centered each and every time that I came out, which was wonderful. Definitely having that ability to just focus on the physical, mental, emotional, and the spiritual capacities will
Mhm.
definitely help a lot of the firefighters for sure.
Yeah, even some of the metro cities have forested areas, green spaces. For myself, I live in the woods essentially, and the power of forest bathing, as some people call it, or just going for a walk in the woods, very therapeutic, very grounding. You're able to be with yourself, really. Even if you have a dog or something with you, you're by yourself and you understand just yourself a bit better. You have that time alone where we live in such a hectic, busy life that we're very seldom just by ourselves thinking.
Even water can be therapeutic that way too. I
Yes.
remember
Yeah.
journaling right after my dad passed away and just how difficult it was and just talking to him spiritually. It was really refreshing, but it really helped to center who I was and the stress I was going through. And yeah, just being by the lake, being by the water, being up in the conservation area. These are the sorts of things that firefighters can do on their days off to really get themselves centered, to really charge themselves so that they can go back in and be 100%. Like, yeah, just there's some really cool life lessons in a very short period of time for sure.
Great. And that's a great book. I'll add that and also the Holmes and Rahe scale into the show notes so people can download that or check it out later.
Cool.
So you talked divorce a little earlier on. What's your thoughts on why that's so high in firefighters and what can we do better? Any thoughts there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the hardest thing for firefighters is our time off.
Mm.
And we're very fortunate to have 24-hour shifts now, 24 hours a day, 7, 8 times a month, which technically still works out to be 192, 196 hours in a month's time. So it's the same as if we were doing a 9 to 5 or a 4 on 4 off. It's what we do with our time off. And because it's a lot of time and a lot of firefighters have type A personalities, it's very difficult to keep yourself engaged if you don't have something else to do. And I think the problem is that if firefighters choose not to also enjoy these passions that they do on their time off, whether that's a second job that they might have or some courses that they take, if they don't nurture their relationships at the same time,
Mm.
they might miss that TSN turning point when things are starting to change within their relationship. And there's a fantastic book by Dr. John Gottman, The 7 Principles for Making Your Marriage Work. And in it, he's pretty much the godfather when it comes to relationship management. And he's got some pretty good tidbits of information in there. And I think firefighters and fire service leaders for that matter, if they apply some of these principles, especially when they have that free time away from the job and nurture those relationships, there's a great propensity that they can actually keep those marriages strong. Because when we're going through divorce, it's a really, and I've never been through one, so I can't really speak to it. I could only imagine what it would be like. But to go through a divorce or a possible divorce and splitting your income, dealing with the childcare situation, losing your home and having to relocate, these are all very stressful events. So it's certainly a lot cheaper to work on your relationship before that TSN turning point comes in. Stay in front of it. Like that Holmes and Rahe stress scale, if you
Mhm.
will, that we want to just be monitoring and managing what we can.
All right, James, let's switch gears and talk a little bit about leadership because I know it's near and dear to your heart as well as mine. As you can see, my bookshelf behind me is
Yeah,
stock
that's pretty
full of
vast.
stock full of leadership and management books. And I know you're on some of the committees for the CAFC, Canadian Association of Fire Chiefs, most importantly the leadership development one. What's your thoughts on leadership, what it means to the fire service? Yeah, we'll start there. So what's leadership mean to you, and how is it so important in the fire service that we need to concentrate more on that?
It's funny because there's so many definitions of leadership out there. They have to stick with something that just resonates with you. And I think I keep resorting back to Simon Sinek and how he just says, if you look after the person to the right of you and you look after the person to the left of you,
Mm.
you are by definition, anthropologically, a leader. And I love that because it really basically demonstrates that it's all about taking care of those under your wing, under your power, under your influence. And I think for me, and I've studied so many different leadership models, leaders in general, whether it's Alan Mullally and when he was at Ford, whether it's Captain D. Michael Abrashoff and the change that he did with the U.S. Benfold and the U.S. Navy, or even Bill Walsh and what he did with the San Francisco 49ers when he first became NFL head coach. It's all about taking care of those under your wing. And I think the leadership is interesting. Leadership comes with power. And when you have power, when you have that ability to influence or control, it all depends on what you want to do it for. So if you want to influence, then that's great. And if you want to control, you have to know when to exactly start working and controlling the environment or the situation because you're in that position to do so. But really, it's more about influencing majority of the time because we just want to empower people. We want people to, what was the one saying is basically to say that if you take care of the people, the business has a way of just take care of yourself. I believe in the empowerment. I believe in engaging firefighters. I believe in empowering them, building that sense of just purpose and responsibility and tapping into cognitive diversities and understanding what we have.
Couldn't agree more. I think it's all about empowering the people and taking care of the people. That's my top kind of motto as well. If I had to sum up leadership, taking care of people is number one, in my opinion, for sure. So you talk a little bit about professional development and mental performance. What's that mean? Because mental performance in the fire service might not necessarily be a term that people are familiar with. What does that mean to you? And why do you think we should look into that a little deeper?
It's funny you asked that because I'm reminded of the one scene in Moneyball where Billy Bean, who's played by Brad Pitt, is meeting with the Boston Red Sox owner. But Billy Bean instituted this sabermetrics concept to baseball to basically try to turn a winning program in funds that he was given and allocated. And even though he didn't win the World Series, even though he didn't make it to the division champs, he set the tone. And it was the owner of the Red Sox that basically, I know you're taking it on the chin, but the first one through the wall is always the bloodiest. In other words, you have to take a chance. You have to take a risk on some very unconventional concepts if you want to broach the conventional world to try something new. Mental performance coaching for fire service is interesting because it really is all about the athletic world. It's all about Olympic athletes and performing arts and even the NCAA. When you look at firefighters, and I believe this holistically, is that firefighters can be regarded as industrial athletes. There is an element of sport within inside the fire service. And as such, coincidentally, working alongside training officers who focus on suppression, mental performance coaches work with the athletes or would work with firefighters to try to deal with how did you deal with the setback? So if someone's going through a promotional system and they're not selected, how do you keep them engaged? How do you keep them from not just throwing their hands up in the air and saying, that's it, forget it, I'm out, blah, blah, blah. How do you keep those people engaged? How do you give them that graduated level of skill set that they're actually prepared for? This is where I firmly believe, just like sabermetrics in the Moneyball, is that we need to try something different. And I think mental performance coaching is just that element where we can actually induce or embed a psychologist within the fire service, but working alongside a training officer to create that whole professional development system.
Would that be essentially like a coach, like a certified coach or a counselor, or you're thinking it would be at a doctor level that this person would be introduced into this fire service?
Mental performance coaching, I believe, is performance psychologist. So I believe you have to have a master's in this. So yeah, it would be higher level education. They would
Okay.
probably be compensated for it as at the same time. But the really cool thing is that mental performance training officers focus mostly on suppression staff to teach them on fireground and rescue techniques. Mental performance coaches would work with all divisions. That's communication, training, mechanics, fire prevention, public education, as well as suppression. And there's no limit to the rank or role. So a mental performance coach could work for even fire service leaders who are interested in having, maybe they're having a difficult time with council. Maybe they're having a difficult time with their fire service leadership team and they're looking for techniques. This is a great way to induce and put in psychology with the fire service. There is a gap there, and I think this is one great way to put them in.
So if we introduce that, say we look ahead 5 years from now and it's introduced and it's mainstream, what would you see the outcome being by introducing a sports psychologist into the world of the fire service? What would be the difference?
The difference would be is I think you'd have a lot of firefighters who are just able to deal with a lot of the challenges that are maybe unpredictable that they're not really prepared for. Having that coach or having that performance psychologist right there gives them skills and techniques and ideas and tools what they can use to just stay with the game kind of thing. My real firm belief is that a lot of the post traumatic stress is not necessarily in response to emergency response. It actually can come from other stressors like organizational stressors as well as personal. Having a psychologist on board, having that person 24 or maybe not 24/7 because it probably would be a daytime staff, but having that individual there gives the firefighter, gives the fire service leader that opportunity to tap into them.
Yeah, great point. Yeah, if I see that day come, I'm going to be very happy as well because I definitely think there's a mental aspect to the fire service that's, like you said, a gap that's missing. James, I've heard you talk quite a bit about character-based leadership, and I know in the fire service that's probably a term that's not used on a regular basis. And some of the listeners might not know what character-based leadership is, and I think it's critical for leaders, fire personnel, to understand what that means. So, do you mind explaining character-based leadership and how you came across it, what it means to you, and how it could improve the fire service?
Sure. Character based leadership was born out of the University of Western Ontario's Ivy School of Business. And it came out of the financial crisis of 2008. And they did a whole bunch of research and they uncovered that character was the missing piece as to why it occurred. Their research and their professors and researchers and all their faculty basically put together a framework and identified that there was character plus competencies plus commitment equals effective leadership. And they uncovered that character, everything surrounded judgment. So there was 10 dimensions that, if you will, that were values, virtues, and traits that leaders could use to affect their judgment. And under each of the dimensions were elements that make up each of the, so one, for example, would be judgment, one would be integrity, one would be temperance, one would be humility. What Ivy found was that it was a better way to identify or to get a holistic leader by having character plus the competencies plus the commitment, which basically the Canada Revenue Agency adopted their program. They found that it was absolutely fantastic. It's been since adopted by the Canada Border Services, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and it's now trickled even into the NHL where the Seattle Kraken and the Montreal Canadiens are actually drawing on Ivy and their research to help them get the right players in place.
How could you see that being useful in the fire service? What kind of areas in the fire service would be improved by introducing character-based leadership?
It's really interesting because the framework itself, you could really put any competencies related to any rank or role in there, and you actually put the framework together. So the consistency with the commitment, the consistency with the character, adding in the competencies as it relates to each rank and role could work for firefighters, could work all the way up to a fire service leader. My original interest, if you will, that why I was interested in the character-based leadership really stemmed from the fact that it was in 2020 and I noticed that there were 20 fire service leaders who were leaving effective immediately. And I was astonished by the fact that there was no reason. There was no reason why a lot of these fire service leaders were leaving. It was I inferred that it really had nothing to do with the competencies, otherwise they wouldn't have been hired in the first place. So then was a question of maybe perhaps it was character. And there were some individuals nationally there was issues of misappropriation of funds. There was issues of sexual misconduct. There was abusive behavior towards subordinates. And I started to realize that these weren't because of competencies that they could do as fire service leaders to do the job. This really had to do with who they were as people.
Yeah, totally. So, James, do you see a fit for character-based leadership in the role of fitting into organizations for recruitment and retention? And that could be volunteer, that could be career. Do you see that being a tool that people could use moving forward?
100%. Character-based leadership, although it was made for leadership, can actually be used for any rank or any role. But I think the interesting thing is that because it's been designed for leadership, I think we really should try and do this at the fire service leadership level. And then by doing that, we actually would stabilize organizations. We would stabilize fire service leader positions, because not only when you see fire service leaders who are leaving effective immediately, it not only disrupts the organization in terms of initiatives, projects, and programs that are being started because someone might come in and want to do other types of things, but it almost creates that instability for that fire service leader themselves. And, if you talk about the Holmes and Rahe stress scale, you talk about another life event or a life change, that individual, unless they found another job right away, they're out of a job, and they might have to find another job that is in another province or another city. And then their families that are being affected. This character-based leadership is definitely profound in a ways that we're hoping, by instituting something that's been research-based, that's been backed by a very highly renowned institution like the University of Western Ontario, that this will really help stabilize that sense of instability that we're seeing within all services, career, combination, and volunteer systems.
Interesting. Where could our listeners get more information about that?
University of Western Ontario's Ivy School of Business, all that stuff and you can access it's on the public domain. You can actually just Google character-based leadership, and that's where it is. Actually, Ivy is actually going down to the National Fire Academy Leadership Symposium in April. They're going to be doing a presentation, followed by Red Team Thinking, which is another fantastic concept, if you will, that was born out of the military, U.S. military, that they're actually going to be doing presentations back to back at the Fire Academy. So those executive fire officer graduates that are going to be there, they're in for a real treat. So that should be good.
Through this podcast, you've mentioned it a few times, and I know you've mentioned it in other articles. People might be wondering, what is a industrial athlete?
Well, I really cannot take full credit for this. I'm having a great conversation with, at that time, actually would have been Deputy Fire Chief Darren Rizzi from Vaughan Fire Services, who's now the Fire Chief of Mississauga. And she was talking about the fantastic work that Vaughan was doing to get their staff up to NFPA standards. And she's saying, we need to just treat the firefighters like they're athletes. And I was like, whoa. And then she said industrial athletes. And I'm like, oh my God, that's an amazing concept. And using my own personal work that I've done with football, and how I think that there's just so much similarities between what goes on in football and what goes on with the fire service in terms of the training that we do, the coaching we have. I thought that concept really resonated. So that whole industrial athlete concept really comes from just taking care of our power, our strength, our back, our flexibility, our endurance, our cardiovascular. So it all plays its part, because there definitely is an element of sport that's missing inside fire.
And it probably dovetails nice with that mental performance as well. So yeah. Football coaches, they all mentally prepare. They have either their private doctor or a team doctor that's helping them through seeing that field goal getting kick at the Super Bowl for that touchdown. They've visualized all that before the game. So I could see that being a key aspect. What do you think about that?
That's an interesting point. And you go back to the Buffalo Bills when they actually were on the verge of winning Super Bowl. I can't remember what it was. And Scott Norwood actually missed the field goal. He would have had to have worked with a mental performance coach to not take on that burden himself, to feel like he was the reason why everything just fell apart and the reason why they lost the Super Bowl. So to keep him up and to keep him engaged, to keep him wanting to work harder again to be the best version he can, he definitely would have had to work with a mental performance coach. So cross-referencing that with the fire service, and if someone makes a mistake on the fire ground, or a deputy fire chief makes a big purchase that turns into an issue that are problematic, this is where these coaches can come in. These performance coaches come in and basically say, we're going to teach you how to work with the failure. We're going to teach you how to bounce back. We're going to show you how you incrementally get back into the game, because that's really what it's all about.
Yeah, I agree. I like that. So human factors, what does that mean? And why would the fire service care about human factors? What does that mean?
You know, it's interesting that we talked originally, or preceding this conversation, talking about character-based leadership, talking about judgment, talk about decision-making. Human factors basically comes in and talks about what are the factors that can affect decision-making. It's sleep, it's unfamiliarity, it's organizational stress, it's maybe someone doesn't have the competence to do the job. There could be so many factors that just affect someone's decision-making. And these are the human factors that we want to take into consideration, so that when we're at the helm and we're responsible for being, again, like that leadership, like you're talking about, what was my definition of leadership, and looking after everyone below, we want to make sure that we're in the best possible states that we can be in, mentally, physically, emotionally, and spiritually, to make those decisions. Human factors just brings that awareness to other things that could be affecting us on the outside, personally, as well as professionally, that we have to just keep in mind.
I recall you mentioning the movie Mayday. How does that pan into it?
It wasn't the movie Mayday. It's actually the Discovery Channel Mayday. And I tape it. I watch it. I've taken notes on it. I think this is what's spurred my interest in getting the Human Factors, Human Performance Committee up and running with the Canadian Association of Fire Chiefs. It's really all about talking, just basically to say, if we take a look at aircraft accidents and we think of it in terms of an organization. So a fire service organization that may be having an accident or an incident that's occurring within the organization. If you take a look at how they've investigated aircraft accidents, you can actually pull apart and say, okay, what are the different factors that have led to this? And then, so when you take a look at what's gone on with some organizations, you start peeling back the layers and you can say, what are the reasons why this is becoming very dysfunctional? You can actually see the different factors. To say that it's not leadership is also to say, maybe we haven't looked into this far enough, where if we look in Mayday, some of the responsibility, some of the reasons why some of these aircraft accidents occurred had a lot to do with the pilots, had a lot to do with the people that were in control. You take a look at probably the most egregious accident that happened in aviation history in 1977 off the island of Tenerife, that two 747s ended up colliding on a runway, although there was some like 584 casualties, but it was the decision by the pilot of the Dutch Airlines, KLM, that decided to leave while another airplane was coming up the runway at that time, that caused this terrible accident. So we're looking at individuals' leadership, who's in charge, that they're going to have all the right information. But he was under incredible pressure to get his plane up and off the ground and back over to Holland. But at the same time, too, he was a former instructor and had not been flying as much as other pilots had been. So he was unfamiliar with a lot of the pressures that being a pilot was doing at the time. So there's so much things that can be transferred from the aviation world and transferred into the fire service. And this is all the things that human factors and Mayday and aircraft accidents and investigations all come into play.
I love that stuff. Crew resource management is something probably some of the fire service listeners right now are familiar with. How does that dovetail into human same or different?
Yeah, I think you take a look at crew resource management, which originated from NASA, and they basically wanted to design something that was basically going to put everyone in the cabin, everyone in the cockpit, they had equal opportunity to know. And I think that's huge, because if all the information and all the control and the decision making was left with the captain, just like what happened with Tenerife, a lot of accidents might have occurred over time. So crew resource management was basically about, how does the pilots work together to basically come up with solving the problem. And this is something that's transferred now into the fire service, where you're responding to a call and the captain in the front seat is basically looking to the driver and saying, what do you think? Or looking to the people in the back and saying, what do you think? Not necessarily saying, I have the ultimate and the only decision making, but if you see something that you think needs to be brought up, bring it up.
Yes. Which also builds a psychologically safe environment as well, right? When people have the voice that they can say a concern or speak up or add a suggestion, right?
100%. And then now you, if I can use your word, dovetail back into the character-based leadership and talking about that character, talking about that sense of humility. If a leader doesn't have humility to allow that dissenting information or to be questioned, maybe what is being done because the leader might not see it, that's not really supporting that character-based leadership piece, that character of humility that we really need to see to create that psychological safety.
Yeah. I love how you just brought everything we talked about in the last 45 minutes or so back into this, and they all work together, right? They all mix and they all work together. So that's awesome.
Thank you.
I'm going to finish off with what's one key message you want our listeners to hear today, to walk away with, one key message that the fire service needs to hear.
I think for me, I think the biggest thing that I'd like to leave the audience with is that, in my humble opinion, the true success of the fire service will be its ability to merge longstanding tradition with private sector best practices, because it's not about just the emergency, it's about the non-emergency. And I think if we can begin to explore, for example, in automation, athletics, and even aviation, and pull some of these best practices out and apply it to our non-emergency times, we can make our environment so strong, so much psychologically safer. We'll have healthier and happier employees, turns into healthier and happier spouses, partners, fathers, mothers. And when that happens, it becomes very cyclical. So this is where I think the organization, as well as the individual, takes their individual responsibility and does whatever they can to keep themselves mentally, physically, emotionally, and spiritually in the best shape they can.
Yeah, love it. Love it. James, I really appreciate our time together. The amount of information and stats and figures and everything you can pull out of your head is impressive. So I just want to thank you for sharing your knowledge with our audience today, episode number 1. And it's been, a real honor to learn some of this, I wouldn't say it's new age, but some more modern principles for leadership, self-care, burnout, everything moving forward, and everything beneath the helmet. So thank you.
Thank you for having me, Arjuna. Thank you.
Great. Stay well.
Thanks, you too.
Thank you for tuning in to Beneath the Helmet. We hope that this podcast has provided you with valuable insights into the world of firefighters' health and wellness. Remember, caring for your physical, mental, and spiritual well-being is crucial to achieving optimal performance. Join us next time on Beneath the Helmet for more inspiring conversations. Until then, stay well.